There's an old fable. The way I heard it was set in ancient China, but it doesn't really matter where the setting is. It's about a farmer, and he's a moderately prosperous farmer in his little village, and his prized possession is a stallion. As this horse is the greatest horse anyone in that village has ever seen. It's a prime specimen, and one day it gets away and runs off. And the people of the village come to the farmer and they say, "Oh, what bad fortune, your horse ran away." And the farmer says, "Well, we'll see." A few days later, the horse comes back, but he's brought with him a wild mare who's followed him. And now that wild mare becomes property of the farmer. So he has a second horse, another fine specimen, potential to breed horses. And all the villagers come to him and say, "Oh, what good fortune, your horse came back." And he says, "We'll see." A few days later, his only son, who is the best worker on his property, is trying to tame this wild mare and is bucked off the horse and breaks his leg. And he's out of commission for the entire planting season. It's going to really affect his productivity. And the people of the village come to the farmer and say, "Oh, what bad fortune, your son broke his leg." And the farmer says, "We'll see." It's a few days later that the king's army comes through town. And they're waging war, and they're recruiting every able-bodied young man to join the king's army. You have no choice. Your chances of survival are slim, but if you refuse, you'll be executed. The only man of military fighting age spared in that village is the farmer's son because he has a broken leg. It's a story that illustrates the randomness of life. It shows that what seems like it should be good isn't always good. What seems like it should be bad isn't always bad. Life just doesn't make sense sometimes. And yet, we are called over and over again to live lives of wisdom. So how can we possibly live with wisdom in a world that so often doesn't make any sense? If the things that seem good can turn out to be bad, if the things that seem bad can turn out to be good, how can we possibly live with wisdom in a world like that? That's a question that the teacher in the book of Ecclesiastes wrestles with in our passage this morning. We're approaching the end of our series. We've got 2 more weeks after today in the book of Ecclesiastes, this series that we're calling Wisdom in the Midst of Life. That central metaphor in the book of Ecclesiastes is that life is like mist. It's brief. We can't control it. We can't predict what it's going to do. And this morning we're looking at a fairly long passage. We're going to be looking from chapter 9, verse 11, all the way through verse 6 of chapter 11 in a message that I'm calling Navigating Nonsense. Because it's all about how nonsensical life can be, and yet in the midst of acknowledging that, we're given lots of practical advice for how to live in a world that so often doesn't make sense. So if you're not there already, go ahead and turn in your Bibles now to Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11. I'll be reading from the New Living Translation, but feel free to follow along in your own preferred translation. Let's begin with verse 11. The teacher says this. He says, "I have observed something else under the sun. The fastest runner doesn't always win the race. The strongest warrior doesn't always win the battle. The wise sometimes go hungry, and the skillful are not necessarily wealthy. And those who are educated don't always lead successful lives. It is all decided by chance, by being in the right place at the right time." So this again is life under the sun, right? We're not taking God's perspective into it. But from that perspective, he's acknowledging something that we all inherently know to be true. And that is that those who should succeed on paper don't always succeed in life. Last night was game 2 of the World Series between the Arizona Diamondbacks and the Texas Rangers. This is quite possibly the most unlikely pairing of World Series competitors in the history of Major League Baseball. One analyst for the MGM, betting analyst, said nobody offered a bet at the beginning of the season for these two to play, but he said if they had at the beginning of the season, the odds would have been 1 in 1,751 that these two teams would play. If you played the season 1,751 times, one of those seasons would have the Diamondbacks and the Rangers in the World Series. Now, probably underestimated how good these teams are. They played well. Their players are talented. I'm sure they will have better odds next season. And yet, if the season started over tomorrow and all the teams had all the same players, these would still not be the favorites to go to the World Series. You know, we'd pick the Braves or the Yankees or the Dodgers or the Astros to go to the World Series because on paper, those teams have better rosters. But here's the thing. Over the course of a 162-game season, there are thousands of little moments that shape the season that nobody can predict, right? That ball on the outside corner, is it going to get called a ball or a strike by the umpire? Nobody knows. Is the wind blowing in or out? Is it going to be a long fly out to the warning track, or is it going to be a game-winning home run? Nobody knows. You can't predict it. Who's going to get injured? Who's going to get hot? Who's going to go into a slump at the wrong time? Those are things that can't possibly be predicted. And so the champion on paper doesn't win. The champion on the field is determined, yes, by skill and ability, but also by all those random factors. And all of life is that way, right? People who succeed in business usually are hardworking and smart people, right? Because they have a better chance. It's like a team with a better roster. They're more likely to win, and yet you don't get that level of success unless some things break your way. So it doesn't mean, he's not saying here that none of these things matter. Speed is obviously important when you're running a race. Strength is obviously important when you're fighting a battle. Wisdom helps supply for you and your family. Education helps you succeed in life, and yet those things are not the sole determining factors. It's like a baseball season. There's so many random things in life that we simply can't predict. That's why the world so often doesn't make sense. He gives another illustration of the randomness of life in verse 12. He says this, he says, people can never predict when hard times might come. Like fish in a net or birds in a trap, people are caught by sudden tragedy. We don't know when hardship is going to strike. We don't know when tragedy is going to strike. There's no way for us to predict it. And so often we're like that fish swimming along. He's doing everything he's always done his whole life. Nothing bad's ever happened swimming through that section of the river or the lake, and a net comes down and scoops him up. He doesn't know what happened. No way that fish could have predicted that. There's nothing that fish should have done differently to keep from getting caught. And that's how it is when bad things happen. Now, as we're going to see, wisdom can help avoid those things. Foolishness can lead to those things. And yet, because of the randomness of life, it can happen that way. And we just need to accept that reality. We are not able to ever prevent bad things from happening to us. There's nothing we can do to ensure that we won't be like that fish caught in the net. So, given life's unpredictable nature, how do we live? What does it look like to live with wisdom in a world that does not make sense? That's the advice, the wise advice that the rest of our passage is going to be doling out. Given the random nature of life, given the unpredictability of it, how do we live well? How do we live wisely in a world filled with nonsense? Well, the first thing we have to recognize is that wisdom is often not appreciated. The teacher tells a little parable of his own here in verses 13 through 16. He says, "Here is another bit of wisdom that has impressed me as I have watched the way our world works. There was a small town with only a few people, and a great king came with his army and besieged it. A poor, wise man knew how to save the town, and so it was rescued. But afterward, no one thought to thank him. So even though wisdom is better than strength, those who are wise will be despised if they are poor. What they say will not be appreciated for long." He's saying even when wisdom demonstrates itself to be valuable, people don't inherently value it. Wisdom is often rejected. Because the fact is, as human beings, most of the decisions we make are not logical. We are governed by our desires. We are governed by our imaginations. We're governed by what captures our heart. Which is, by the way, why God didn't write a theological treatise when he wrote the Bible. There's theology in there. But most of the Bible is written in poetry and stories and using image, because God understands that we can have our logical brains all lined up correctly theologically, and that's not going to help us live the kind of life we're called to live. He wants to capture our hearts. Wisdom, as valuable as it is, does not always capture the human heart. And so we go to what's appealing. And so if we see someone as poor and they're not successful in life, even if they've proven themselves to be wise, we kind of instinctively reject them and gravitate towards someone who maybe is foolish, but appears to have all the things that we would want that capture our hearts. And yet, wisdom is still valuable. Verses 17 and 18. Better to hear the quiet words of a wise person than the shouts of a foolish king. Better to have wisdom than weapons of war, but one sinner can destroy much that is good. So even though wisdom is often rejected, wisdom doesn't always capture our hearts, the teacher wants us to know that it is actually valuable. It's actually useful. Even in a world gone crazy, even in a world where chaos reigns, where nothing makes sense at times, wisdom is valuable. And we should value it, and we should treasure it. But we should also know its limits. And one of the key limits of wisdom in a world that often doesn't make sense is that a little bit of folly goes a long way to undo a lot of wisdom. That's kind of the theme of the next 7 verses as we move into chapter 10. Let's start with just verse 1, though. It says, "As dead flies cause even a bottle of perfume to stink, so a little foolishness spoils great wisdom and honor." You've heard that phrase, a fly in the ointment. This is where it comes from. It's actually probably talking not about perfume, but medicinal ointment. But the idea is this. If you have something really valuable, in the ancient world, a medicinal ointment or an expensive perfume is extremely valuable. And you put some dead flies in there, doesn't matter how valuable it is, right? You're not going to want to rub that stuff on your skin. It's gross, right? In the same way, you can have lots of wisdom. You mix in a little folly, a few bad choices along the way, and it can undo all of the value of that wisdom. Verses 2 through 4 talk a little bit about what it looks like when folly is unraveling wisdom. He says, "A wise person chooses the right road. A fool takes the wrong one." He says, you can identify fools just by the way they walk down the street. And then here's a practical example. If your boss is angry at you, don't quit. A quiet spirit can overcome even great mistakes. You have to be wise all the way through, right? You can be on the right road for a long time, one foolish moment, one wrong turn, you're on the wrong road and you're in trouble. You can work hard and diligently and make good choices, put yourself in a good position with your employment. You lose your temper with your boss one time, it can undo all of that. Verse 5 says, "There is another evil that I have seen under the sun. Kings and rulers make a grave mistake." 5 through 6 here. "When they give great authority to foolish people and low positions to people of proven worth." And then he continues in verse 7, I have even seen servants riding horses like princes and princes walking like servants." Here's another way that foolishness can undo wisdom. Oftentimes, foolish people are put over wise people, right? Maybe you've heard of the Peter principle. It's this idea that somebody continues to get promoted until they reach a job that they can't do well, and then they stay there, right? So often people are at the exact level in the pecking order where they are least effective. And some of us that have had bosses have seen that at work, right? Sometimes the people in charge aren't the ones that should be in charge. And that can frustrate the people underneath them that are wise. Now, we should have some humility here and recognize that all of us are victims of the Peter principle, right? It's easy to see the person above us as more foolish than we are wise. Sometimes we're not as quick to see the people below us as potentially wiser than we are. But the fact is, where people rank, the amount of authority and influence they have is not directly proportionate to how much wisdom they have. So a little foolishness can be like a fly in the ointment that spoils the wisdom of others because of the authority fools are often given. Here's another bit of wisdom, another thing that we need to keep in mind in a world that is full of chaos that doesn't always make sense. Verses 8 and 9. Teacher says, when you dig a well, you might fall in. When you demolish an old wall, you could be bitten by a snake. When you work in a quarry, stones might fall and crush you. When you chop wood, there is danger with each stroke of the axe. Sounds like a good reason not to do any work, right? That's the point here. No matter what you do, there's always risk. There's risk of failure. There's risk of danger. There's risk that when you tame that horse, you might break your leg. And yet the task is still worth doing. You just have to accept that there's risk in everything. This is not saying we shouldn't work. This is not saying we shouldn't take risks. But it's just acknowledging that anything you do, even normal, ordinary, good work, these are all examples of normal, ordinary, good work in the ancient world, things that would need to be done, that wise, hardworking people would undertake, they all entail risk. We can't avoid it. It's just part of life in our chaotic world. So is there any value then to wisdom? I mean, if bad things can happen when you're doing the right thing and good things can happen when you're not doing the right thing, do we just throw up our hands and quit, not even try and do things the right way? No. Look at verse 10. Using a dull axe requires great strength, so sharpen the blade. That's the value of wisdom. It helps you succeed. I love this illustration, right? Because you can chop wood with a dull axe. It's just harder, right? It makes your life more difficult. It makes your life more challenging, right? And that's really all wisdom does. It just makes life a little easier. It's still hard work to chop wood with a sharp axe. You see two people chopping wood next to each other, you can't immediately tell which one has the sharp axe and which one has the dull axe. The other thing I like about this illustration is because if you're chopping wood and you notice that your axe is dull, you have to stop and take a minute to look at it and then take some time to actually sharpen it. And the guy chopping wood with the dull axe might think you're an idiot, right? Because he's getting wood chopped and you're not. Wisdom isn't always obviously productive. But there's a point at which exercising some reflection, exercising some wisdom improves your ability to succeed. And yet, there's still hard work. There's still randomness and chance. But you'd rather chop wood with a sharp axe than a dull one. And you'd rather try and navigate the life of nonsense that we're all facing with wisdom than without it. Success isn't guaranteed. It's still going to be hard work. But for the most part, you're going to do a lot better if you sharpen your axe. And so we should seek wisdom. And yet, we need to acknowledge that wisdom is insufficient. It does not guarantee success. It does not solve all of our problems. Look at verse 7. He says, if a snake bites before you charm it, what's the use of being a snake charmer? If a snake bites before you charm it, what's the use of being a snake charmer? Now, this is kind of an odd image here of a snake charmer, right? The idea of somebody that can I don't know, hypnotize or whatever they do to a snake to keep it from biting you. It's kind of tying back to that image of the snake biting you out of the wall. But I also think here that the teacher is tapping into an image that goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, that goes all the way back to ancient mythology. Serpents represent chaos in the ancient world. And you remember that the tempter in the garden came in as a snake and introduced sin into the world. And with sin came chaos. That's when everything started falling apart. Look, wisdom can help us solve some of the problems that come in a broken world, but it cannot undo the brokenness of the world. The world's been bit. And you could have all the skill in the world, all the wisdom in the world, even something as mystical and hard to understand as the ability to charm a snake. It does not change the fact that our world is broken. And there is going to be chaos. And it isn't going to make sense. And this is a key principle for us, right? That wisdom can never completely overcome the chaos of our broken world. No matter how wise you are, disaster can still strike like a fish caught in a net. No matter how wise you are, that hard work that you're doing can result in harm. No matter how wise you are, you can't predict the future because there's so much randomness in the world. So wisdom is good. Wisdom is valuable. It's better to chop wood with a sharp axe than a dull one, and yet the world's been bit. We need to understand that. We need to accept that. Look at verses 12 through 14. Actually, we're going to look all the way through 18 here for a bit as we talk about folly. Because the alternative to wisdom is folly. And folly brings tragedy. So even though the world is broken, even though wisdom doesn't guarantee success, folly almost always brings disaster eventually. And here are some different aspects of folly that were given here by the teacher. Verses 12 through 14 says this: wise words bring approval, but fools are destroyed by their own words. Fools base their thoughts on foolish assumptions, so their conclusions will be wicked madness. They chatter on and on. No one really knows what is going to happen. No one can predict the future. You ever meet somebody who tells you they have a guaranteed way for you to get rich quick? You're talking to a fool. Doesn't mean that there might not be a good investment opportunity. But if they say they know, it's a sure thing, and it's easy, and it's fast, they're a fool. No one knows. No one can predict. But fools are assuming things, right? They're not taking into account the fact that the world is unpredictable. They're imagining everything lining up exactly how they want it to. Everything's going to fall into place perfectly. And they make boasts based on that. They talk a big game based on that. Wisdom is more humble, speaks prudently. But a fool's mouth will get him into trouble, and his confidence in his own assumptions will get him into trouble. It's another thing about fools. Verse 15, fools are so exhausted by a little work that they can't even find their way home. They're lazy. They're lazy. Hard work and diligence are an expression of wisdom in the Bible. I know sometimes in our culture we sort of think of, the smart, wise people as being kind of lazy, and they sit on their rear ends and think about stuff, and good blue-collar, hard-working people, they're not as intellectual, they're not thinking, but they work hard. But that's not the picture we get in the Bible, right? The Bible, the wise work hard. It's the fools that don't work hard. Not only do fools fail to work hard, they're overindulgent. Look at verses 16 and 17. What sorrow for the land ruled by a servant. And here by a servant, the idea is a servant is someone who was not trained or equipped to rule well. Someone who's not qualified. Okay, that's the idea. Land ruled by a servant, the land whose leaders feast in the morning. Happy is the land whose king is a noble leader, someone who's qualified, well-trained, and whose leaders feast at the proper time to gain strength for their work, not to get drunk. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week party, that's a fool. That's unsustainable. That doesn't lead to good things for you, or especially for anybody that you're responsible for. There is a place for feasting, but a wise person knows the proper place for it. They're lazy, they're overindulgent, and fools are negligent. Look at verse 18. Laziness leads to a sagging roof. Idleness leads to a leaky house. Okay? If you're not hardworking and you're always having a party, you don't have time to fix the leaks. You don't have time to do the maintenance. You don't have time to do the things that you need to do to keep your quality of life in a good place. And that is the life of a fool. And it all brings about hardship. a fool might get lucky once or twice because the world is a random place. But over time, folly will bring tragedy. So how do we proceed? What's some of this more wise advice here? There's a few more bits of advice that the teacher wants to give us as we try to navigate the nonsense of our world, understanding that wisdom isn't perfect, but it has value, and that folly doesn't guarantee instant downfall, but it ultimately brings tragedy. And the first bit of advice we find in verse 19, and it's kind of a callback to our message from last week. He says, a party gives laughter, wine gives happiness, and money gives everything. He's saying, enjoy the good things in life. Fools overindulge in these things, but there's benefit to them. There's value. They're gifts from God, right? That's like we talked about last week. There's nonsense in the world, but in the midst of that nonsense, there's opportunities for joy. And we can recognize that, and we can appreciate that. Those things are missed. They're not ultimate, but along the way, we should appreciate those things. Here's another piece of advice. Verse 20. Never make light of the king, even in your thoughts, and don't make fun of the powerful, even in your own bedroom. For a little bird might deliver your message and tell them what you said. Ever heard that phrase, a little bird told me? That's where it comes from, right? It's not actually talking about a literal bird, right? What he's saying don't even think the things. Because if you think them, they're going to come out of your mouth. And if they come out of your mouth, even in a setting where you don't think anybody's going to hear, eventually, chances are what you think is going to come out your mouth, and what comes out your mouth is going to make its way to the ears of that person. So here's the litmus test. That thing that you're thinking about that other person, would you be willing to say it to them? Would you be willing to say it to them in their presence? Because if not, you probably shouldn't be thinking it. Now, this isn't addressing the morality of that, right? The New Testament talks about the sin of gossip and how destructive gossip is. But this is just saying practically, right? If you're talking bad about somebody, it's probably going to get back to them, and you're going to have to deal with that. In this case, it's the king, someone with more power than you. But I think the principle applies across all relationships. We need to watch our words. We need to be disciplined in being willing to say hard things when they're worth saying. And if they're not worth saying, then we need to not dwell on them. Not meditate on them, not think about them a lot, and certainly not say them to others behind someone's back. Here's some more good advice. Chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Send your grain across the seas. Your translation might say, cast your bread upon the waters. This is an interpretive decision, but I think this is probably the correct interpretation. Send your grain across the seas, and in time profits will flow back to you. But divide your investments among many places, for you do not know what risks might lie ahead. He's saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? Or in this case, don't put all of your grain shipments on one trading ship. It might sink. Modern day equivalent of this is diversify your portfolio, right? Because the fact is we live in a chaotic world. We live in an unpredictable world. You don't know that any of your investments are going to succeed. Now, that you can't avoid risk, right? He's not saying just dig a hole and bury your money in it. He's not saying just hoard all of your grain. Risk is part of life. You can't avoid risk. You encounter risk when you chop wood or when you break down a wall. Risk is part of life. But when you understand that risk is everywhere, one principle that comes out is you try and spread that risk out so that any one failure isn't going to be devastating to you. And that the profits you make from other places where you've taken wisely considered risks are going to outweigh that. So yes, take risks, but take them wisely. Diversify your portfolio. And this can apply beyond finances, right? This can apply to how we spend our time. Don't invest everything in one relationship or in one activity because there's no guarantees. Don't invest all of your emotional energy into one thing. Now, we can always put everything into our relationship with the Lord because there's no risk there. But in terms of serving Him, in terms of living out this life, everything that we do, there's risk. And if we understand that, we're not going to put all our eggs in one basket. We're not going to put all our grain on one ship. We're going to diversify. More advice here, verses 3 and 4. When clouds are heavy, the rain comes down. Whether a tree falls north or south, it stays where it falls. Farmers who wait for perfect weather never plant. If they watch every cloud, they never harvest. So here's a picture of something completely chaotic, completely uncontrollable, and that's the weather. And the teacher is saying, listen, the weather does what the weather's going to do, and you can't undo it, right? If a storm blows down a tree, good luck. You can't put that tree back. It is where it fell. And so anytime we go outside, anytime we encounter weather, we are not in control. There are going to be things that happen that we can't control or predict. But don't allow that to keep you from living. Don't allow that reality to paralyze you. Imagine a farmer who never plants unless he's sure the weather's going to do exactly what it's supposed to do. You're never sure. The weather is never certain. You're always taking risks. If every time you see a cloud in the sky, say, well, can't do any work today, it might rain. You're not going to get anything done. You just have to live with the chaos of life. You have to accept your limitations and press on, press forward. That might seem discouraging, but there's hope here. Look at verse 5. Just as you cannot understand the path of the wind or the mystery of a tiny baby growing in its mother's womb, so you cannot understand the activity of God who does all things. See, it's important in a world that so often doesn't make sense to know what you don't know, to have the humility to recognize that there's a lot of things in life that we just don't understand. We can't predict the weather. Even today with all of our technology, I mean, they've gotten a lot better at it, but there's really no certainty, right? We cannot, with all of our amazing medical technology, reproduce even a semblance of what happens in the womb. That's a miracle of God. We understand it a little bit better now, but imagine in ancient times, imagine all the things that happen to a woman's body when she gets pregnant. Now, there's reasons for all of that. God understands, but they don't always make a whole lot of sense to the woman, do they? And yet, if she knows she's pregnant, she has hope, she has confidence that God is doing a work in her body, bringing a child to life through her that's going to be born, that's going to be a great source of joy. So all those strange, mysterious things happening to her, uncomfortable that they may be, don't distress her because she's trusting in a miracle that she doesn't understand. See, this is good news when we understand that we don't know everything, because our trust is in a good God who is sovereign. God is in control. When the tree falls north or south, we don't know, but God does. He accounted for that. When the horse runs away, God knows exactly what's going to happen all the way along, even though we couldn't possibly predict it. When that net comes down and snatches the fish out of the water, God is watching. We sang that song this morning, His eye is on the sparrow. That comes from Jesus talking in the Sermon on the Mount about how 2 sparrows are sold for a penny and yet not one falls to the ground without God knowing about it. And then he says, how much more valuable are you than sparrows? God loves us. He's in control. He knows everything that's going to happen. The world is not nonsense to Him. It's not chaos to Him. It's not confusing to Him. And this is a second key principle that we need to keep in mind here. God works in ways that we can never fully understand. All of that chaos, all of that randomness, all of that sudden tragedy, none of that catches God off guard. None of that means that God's plans are frustrated. And it might not make sense to us, just like a baby growing in a womb might not make sense to us, just like weather patterns might not make sense to us. But that's okay. We're not supposed to know everything. We're not supposed to understand everything. We can still know that God is at work because He works in ways that we can never fully understand. And that brings us to verse 6. What do we do about this? This is the closing piece of advice for our passage this morning. He says, plant your seed in the morning and keep busy all afternoon, for you don't know if profit will come from one activity or another or maybe both. You're never guaranteed success. Success is never certain, so that should motivate you to work hard. I remember back years ago, I worked for a staffing agency, and one of the most frustrating things is I would call people up if we had an opening, and they would turn me down. They were out of work. They would turn me down because they'd interviewed for a different job earlier that week, and that was the job they wanted. And so they didn't want to interview for a second job. That always seemed crazy to me because you don't know if you're going to get that job. If you get that job and this one, oh, big problem. You got to turn somebody down. Right? But that's the mentality of a fool. Well, I want that to happen. I think that's going to happen, so I'm going to count on that. They plant their seed, and then they take the rest of the day off. You don't know if that seed's going to grow. So you better go work in the next field too. Because of the uncertainty of life, we should work hard. We don't know where we will find success and where we will encounter failure, so we keep pressing on. Now that might sound discouraging because it's possible, he says, or maybe both will profit. It's also possible that none of them will profit, right? Because the fact is this world is chaotic. We can't predict anything. We can't avoid disaster. We can't guarantee prosperity. No matter how hard we work, no matter how wise we are, we're not in control. So what do we do? Do we just work in a frenzy and are always stressed out because any disaster could strike at any moment? Do we throw up our hands and say, nothing I do matters anyway? Throughout this series, we've been consistently looking to the New Testament to give us some gospel clarity on these principles that we find in Ecclesiastes. We're going to do that again this morning. We're going to turn to the book of James. James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. How can I live well? How can I live wisely when the world doesn't make sense? I think we get a picture of it here in James chapter 4. Look at verse 13 and 14 with me. It says, "Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we are going to a certain town and will stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit." How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. Notice the imagery that James taps into there? Your life is like the morning fog. It's a mist. It's a vapor. You think you can tell me what's going to happen for the next year? Come on. I mean, if I could do that, I would have had money down on the Diamondbacks in the World Series, right? I'd be a rich man. We don't know. And this is the arrogant boasting of the fool, to say, this will happen. In this world that makes no sense, I know what will happen. My work will be profitable. I will succeed. This is what Ecclesiastes is warning us against. So we can all just go back to bed, right? Because nothing we do can't control it anyway. Not so fast. Not so fast. We have to embrace our limitations, but that doesn't mean we give up. Look at verses 15 through 17 here. James 4, 15 through 17. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you are boasting about your own pretentious plans. All such boasting is evil. And a lot of times people end there. But look at verse 17. Remember, it is sin to know what you ought to do and then not do it. It is sin to go back to bed because you can't guarantee that you're going to be successful. It is sin to simply refuse to do good things because there might be a snake in that wall. We embrace our limitations, we make the best decisions that we can, and we submit all of it to God's sovereignty with a humble heart. We should pray and plan. Some people talk like those are two opposite approaches to life, right? Well, I pray and wait for God to do it, or I plan and I do it on my own agenda. We need both. If I'm just planning, if I'm just counting on my own plans to come to fruition, I'm going to be incredibly frustrated because this world makes no sense. The horse is going to run away. The snake is going to be in the wall. The tree is going to fall. I'm going to be caught in a net like a fish. And then what do? Because my plans will be frustrated. They will go wrong eventually. I guarantee it. That's why I have to pray. Because when I pray, I remember that God knows where the tree is going to fall. God knows when the net is coming. God knows that the horse is coming back. And so now it's okay if my plans don't work out, because his plan is right on schedule. Yes, I need to plan. Yes, I need to work. Yes, I need to apply wisdom to my life. But always, always remembering that God is in control. And those provide the two barriers, the two sort of markers for living a wise life. Accepting our limitations and embracing God's sovereignty. We need to embrace our limitations and God's sovereignty. That lays the foundation for living wisely in a chaotic world. Every single piece of advice we encountered really has to do with one of those two things, right? Accepting our limitations, trusting in God's sovereignty. I can enjoy the good gifts because they're a gift from God. I'm trusting in God's sovereignty. I don't need to be distressed when wisdom is rejected by sinful people because I'm trusting in God's sovereignty. But I'm not going to boast. I'm not going to stop working just because I planted some seeds and I'm confident they're going to grow, because I have limitations. But embracing our limitations and God's sovereignty together, that lays the foundation for living wisely in our chaotic world. How do we live this out practically? How do we apply this principle? I think there's three things we need to continue to do. We need to remember. First, we need to accept the chaos of life. The world's a chaotic place. We just need to accept that. And I have limitations. Pretending otherwise is foolish. We just don't know what's going to happen. And yet, understanding that, we still act as wisely as we can, right? I can wear my seatbelt and drive the speed limit and obey all the traffic laws. I could still be killed in a car accident tomorrow. But I'm going to wear my seatbelt and try to obey the traffic laws because I've got a better chance if I do that. Act as wisely as we can in light of the chaos of the world. But that can really stress us out unless we remember step 3, and that is to trust in God's sovereignty. God is in control. God has a plan, and it's a good plan. And if I love him, I'm participating in that plan, and I'm not going to mess that plan up. I can do the good that I'm called to do, not worried about whether my plans are going to become successful or not, knowing that if I'm faithfully pursuing his agenda, his plan is going to come to fruition through me. And when we have all three of those things together, the chaos of this world isn't a threat to us. We accept it. We know it's real. We know we're limited. We act as wisely as we can. We sharpen our axe, knowing that that's going to make life a little easier. That's going to give us a little bit better chance of success. But it's not our sharp axe that we're ultimately trusting in. It's the God of the universe who knows whether that tree is going to fall to the north or the south. That's where our hope is. That's where our confidence is. And that's how we can live wisely in a world that so often makes no sense at all. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the gift of wisdom. We thank you that it helps us navigate this nonsensical world. We know that sin has corrupted this world, that no amount of wisdom can undo the chaos and unpredictability that we face. And yet you've given us wisdom in your word and through your people that helps us navigate that chaos, that helps us navigate that nonsense more effectively. And yet, God, we thank you that you have not asked us to put our ultimate hope in our wisdom or our skill or our ability to navigate the nonsense, but in the fact that none of it is nonsense to you. That you know the patterns of the wind. You know how you weave together an infant in its mother's womb. You understand everything that is happening, and you have a good plan. God, help us to trust in that, to have the confidence and peace that comes from that, so that we can navigate the nonsense of this world with wisdom, but also the peace and confidence that comes from knowing our limitations and trusting in your sovereignty. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.